This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. With me this week, two just really great folks, Tia Vasiliou.
Hello.
And Paul Jasley.
Hello.
Thank you both for coming onto the show this week. Thank you for joining me this week, I should say. It feels good to be back. I know we recorded an episode last week, but I feel like I'm still just like getting back into the swing of things after we had like 2 weeks off. So my brain is all over the place, and unfortunately I haven't read that many comic books, but I have read some. But I want to know how you guys have been. I want to know what comic books you've been reading. So let's just get right into that. Let's start with you, Paul. How are you? How have comic books been? All that jazz.
Oh, I am doing great. Luckily, I've been reading a ton of comics lately. I've been reading an obscene amount of 80s Batman comics. I finished reading a bunch of obscene amount of 80s Superman comics, and I've moved on to 80s Batman comics. It's been lovely.
Oh, wow.
But actually, a couple books specifically I want to talk about on the show today. One is a new Image series that actually came out a couple weeks ago. I didn't get a chance to talk about on the show, but I want to. It's MCMLXXV #1, which, if you know your Roman numerals, that of course is 1975. It's a new series by Joe Casey, and with art by Ian McEwan. This book was great. I picked up the first issue on a whim, just 'cause I really like the cover of it. And it turns out the story is about a New York cab driver in the year 1975, hence the title, who is given by, I believe, her grandfather an enchanted tire iron, and she uses it to fight demons while she drives a taxi cab.
Hell yeah.
And that's pretty much all you need to know. And the art is fantastic, but I just love the vibe of it. It's that 1975 gritty urban jungle New York kind of vibe. There's all sorts of gangs of demons that she has to fight, and it kind of reminds me of like a supernatural version of the Warriors in that sense. And Ian McEwan's art is just lovely. There's so many awesome fight scenes, that real dramatic, full page spreads and stuff. Just a really cool book and a cool vibe. There's another reference to the Warriors. You have like a narrator. The cab driver listens to a radio station while she drives, and they show the guy talking the microphone, and it's just like the narrator in the Warriors. The red light and the microphone up against the lips. So
nice. They're
channeling that vibe, and it's really cool. So I guess if you like the Warriors, you have to read this comic.
God damn it, Paul.
Sorry.
You got me.
Yeah, I figured, enchanted tire iron, New York cab driver, that's a hard thing to pass up.
Yeah.
The other book I want to mention briefly that I read today, like many Batman fans, I was pretty saddened to hear that Norm Breyfogle, the Batman artist from the late 80s, early 90s, had passed away last week. As someone that started reading Batman comics in the late 80s and early 90s, Norm Breyfogle's art is so iconic. Like, when I think of Batman, I kind of picture his take on the character. It's so important, so essential. He's an amazing artist, and I think he's one of the essential Batman artists in the whole history of the character. So I found an issue that I had bought out of the dollar bin, of course, a while back, that he drew. It was Batman Holy Terror, which is an Elseworld story that DC did back in 1991. And it ended up being a really interesting story. It was written by Alan Burnett, who has written some of my other favorite Batman stories. This one is actually about a version of the United States that never separated from England, and was actually a theocracy controlled by the Church of England. And Bruce Wayne is an ordained minister as a part of the church, and he finds out that his parents were actually killed by the state itself. There's a small, powerful group of people within the state government who decided to have Martha and Thomas killed because they provided abortions, and they were working against the state's control of sex and sexual identity and sexual orientation.
Oh, wow.
So they were killed for that. And then Batman kind of takes on himself to be someone working within the system to bring down the state government or the state religion. It's a really interesting book. And yeah, Breyfogle's art in it is just lovely. There's a whole fight sequence for the end that is just stunning to look at. So it was nice to revisit that stuff. And as I said, I'm reading a lot of Batman comics. I can't wait to get into some 90s stuff and read more of Breyfogle's artwork. So that's what I've been reading.
That sounds great, man. Are you just like on this religious Batman kick after Batman the Dam came out or something? Or
it's funny. I never made that connection.
Batman? Yeah.
I passed up buying a copy of Batman Damned because, admittedly, I'm not a big fan of
penis.
No, I mean that's. I have no issue with the Bat Wang or Little Wayne. I've never liked Bryson Azzarello as a writer, specifically as a Batman writer, so that's why I skipped it. But of course, I was in the shop the next day, and I was talking to the guy at the comic shop I go to, who was saying, like, yeah, I should have just bought a copy and flipped it on eBay. I'm like, yeah, I hate doing that, but this is the one time I would have been okay with it, because, gosh, that issue's going for, like, what, $50 at this point? So
yeah, Midtown had it in the shop for $20 the next day.
That's
like
crazy.
After all of the huge controversy, or quote unquote controversy, all the screenshots that people were posting on Twitter, it was like, oh, I guess we should mark this up, because I was going to go buy a copy.
That, I think it's not because of controversy, but because DC is going to like sanitize it in future printings and in digital.
Yeah. And it just reeks of forced obsolescence, if that makes sense, or a forced a way of driving up the value of the comic.
So cynical, but probably true. But so
I
cynical.
see through their games. I've been buying comics a long time. I see right through their games. So.
You know what, though? I have to say, I just am kind of like, you know what? Women's like body parts have been used to sell comics forever. And like, so you know what? If you want to like bring out the Lil Wayne to move some merchandise, like, are we evening up the playing field here? I'm with you.
Sure. Well, Tia, how have you been? How have comic books been? All that, let's check in with you.
Oh, everything's great. Everything's great.
Mm-hmm.
The world is wonderful.
Yeah.
Comics are wonderful.
I know that you've been like getting shredded at the gym a lot.
I have been getting shredded at the gym a lot. That's all your Twitter has been. It's mostly just been like, you know what? I'm going to go kill myself at the gym today. I expect the next time I see you, you're just going to be an extra 7 inches taller, and you could crush my head between your like arms or something like that. Like, give me a headlock and just kill me. I mean, I do have a 6-pack now. I can report.
Nice.
And I go to the gym twice a day, about 4 days a week, and once the other days. So yeah, you're getting shredded at the gym is what you're saying. But I do still have time to read comics because
that's awesome.
Because comics. So this week I, of course, read, and I won't talk about it much, but I'll just mention The Wicked and the Divine 1372 1, 2. I think there's a typo in my notes here. I think it's 1372. The special, the historical special, where Lucifer is a nun and none more goth, obviously. And okay, this issue was actually super gross. Okay. It was not sexy. I mean, gross in the sense that like, if you were ever wondering how to connect Kieran Gillen's Crossed with his like more pop work, like this would be a good one to make that jump over there. Yeah, the artist was I totally just lost his name now. The artist is, I think, the artist who worked with Kieran on 3. It's really great.
Ryan Kelly.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
beautiful, gorgeous art, love it, but like a lot of plague sores. Yeah, it's just like, it's not a sexy one, guys. So a lot of plague, a lot of self-flagellation going on. It's like very medieval. Okay. So anyway, the one I want to talk about today is Maneaters #1. This is the new Image book by Chelsea Kane of course, Mockingbird infamy, and recently canceled before it was even released Vision, which I like kind of wanted to just start emailing Odd Cook, the artist on that series, and being like, I know you've got pages, girl, just let me see them. Anyway, Kate Niemczyk is the artist for Maneaters, who was the artist on Mockingbird, which is great, and I hope I'm saying her name right. And if I am not, we will add to the database. And Rochelle Rosenberg's doing the color, so it's like they got the band back together, That's awesome. So it's really kind of frustrating that it wasn't the like feminist knock it out of the park book that everyone was hoping it was going to be, because it actually has some problems that we need to talk about. Okay. So, yeah. Well, the concept is that because of a mutation in the toxoplasmosis parasite, which is the parasite that's in cat poop that anyone who's ever scooped cat poop like has in them, and this is why pregnant women are not supposed to clean the kitty litter box, because So anyway, there's a mutation that causes young women to basically turn into like were-panthers during their period and kill everybody, which, you know, is not what you want. So they come up with all of these ways to like suppress these things, and it doesn't like super go into all of the science of it in the book, but you know, basically the idea is that like the biology of periods is dangerous. Cool. The problem here for a lot of people is, you know, and that I should rephrase that. The problem that a lot of people noticed right away, it's a problem for everyone, not just for some people, is that this sort of verges on, I'm going to use an acronym here, TERF territory. So this is an acronym that stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists, which basically means that they insist that, you know, like the biology of womanhood is what makes you a woman. And so that is like pretty horrible in terms of like, you know, trans women who are women, even though they don't have this particular biological cycle. And it's also really shitty for trans men who have biological goings on that don't match their gender. And then of course you also have like non-binary, like basically it's just like, it's really limiting and it's really exclusionary, and it makes, you know, it reinforces some ideas that are really harmful that we don't want. And for a creator who is really positioned as this, like, you know, leading the charge of feminist comics, really not what you were hoping for. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So look, this is the first issue. There's time to fix all these problems, and I hope that they do. And I like to believe that this creative team cares for real about their, you know, their messaging and their politics, and having intersectional feminism be a really strong core concept of the book. So I hope that these things will be addressed. I wish that they hadn't left room for all of the, you know, for it to be a question, basically.
Yeah. I haven't had a chance to read this yet, so thanks for the heads up, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think you'll still check out number 2 despite that?
You know, I mean, yeah, because I really have faith that this creative team will address some of these issues, and I think that the discourse around this book is a really good example of, like, you know, it's not about getting one over on someone because they messed up. It's about saying, hey, you messed up, and then them going, oh shit, I did, let me fix that. You know what I mean? Like, if we could actually make that happen, that would be a good model for moving forward in other situations.
Totally. I mean, and yeah, fingers crossed Chelsea Kane can definitely pull that one for us.
Yeah.
Or for readers in general, I guess. Well, for me, I've like I said, I haven't been reading a lot, and I don't know why. Like, my circadian rhythm has been totally thrown in a muck, and I don't know why. So I'm like tired and awake at really weird times. So the only things that I've been able to really sit down and read are volumes of manga that I have. So because I knew that they were due at the library and I needed to read them before they were due. So I sat down and I read volume 14 of Monster by Naoki Urasawa. And I think I've talked about this book on the show before, and at this point I'm too deep into the series to really talk about anything. The long and short is, this is a book about bad people and how everything is awful, and yet somehow we can find hope as humans to bring justice, or bring people to justice who have done wrong, or at least get one over on them in some capacity, so that they know that they've done a bad thing and they have to make up for it. So it's a really dark, weird series that is, I would really recommend to people who like a good suspense story, because every volume leaves me like more tense than the previous volume, and I don't know if that's healthy, and maybe that's why I'm not sleeping well, but I'm really enjoying this book. It's absolutely beautiful. Urasawa is a master of creating tension on a page, and I can't stop reading this book. I think there's like around 20 or 24 volumes of this, so I'm halfway through, and the story is still just as compelling as volume 1. The other book that I read was Black Clover Volume 1 by Yuki Tabata. This is a book that Renee had told me to read a long time ago, like months ago, because I know that he reads this like week to week as the chapters come out. But the story is young Asta, he's the main character. He was born with no magical ability in a world where magic is everything. So obviously he wants to become the Wizard King, the person who is the most powerful wizard in all the land, who controls or he's not like a dictator, but he is like the leader of the people of this world. The story on the whole is very volume 1 shonen manga, where you've got a hero and he's got a rival and he's really bad at this thing, but he has this awesome ability. He's just given this ability for some reason, or he's born with some ability. So he gets to, fight against all these other people, and he's got a power that no one's ever seen before, or they haven't seen in thousands of years. And on the whole, this mostly just reminds me of Bleach, but straight to the point, and less like there's actually a plot. And the Tabata actually knows what he's doing in writing the story. So I enjoyed Volume 1. I think I might wait to read more of this because I just want to get through my dumb volleyball manga before I really dive into another ongoing series. Because that's how I live my life. I just read nonstop manga and X-Men comics. I've become a two-prong individual.
At least you're diversifying your tastes a little bit, right?
Yeah.
It's not all X-Men all the time.
Right. I have, I guess, evolved in some capacity. But yeah, let's talk about comic books that are coming out this upcoming week. Comic books are being released on October 3rd, 2018. What are you both excited for this week? Tia, let's start with you.
All right. Well, Euthanauts number 3 comes out this week. This is a Black Crown book by Teenie Howard and Nick Robles. And this book is like all the Tia things. It's basically about like this woman who works at a funeral home, and she's really interested in death, and she gets like recruited, I guess, by this group who explores the beyond, like death, basically, like what happened beyond. It's basically about like what if you could explore where you go when you die in the same way you could explore space or something like that. I haven't actually started this series yet. It's been in my like to read pile, and like, come on, Tia, get with it. Number 3 is coming out. How have you let it go for 3 months? I'll probably pick up the first 3 issues at Comic-Con this weekend.
Very cool. Oh yeah, New York City Comic Con is this upcoming weekend. I keep forgetting that.
Wow, that's
you
right.
should probably remember and show up.
I should. Yeah, I will be there. I know that I'm going to be there, but I keep forgetting to tell people that I'm going to be there.
We're both
so
I think
there. Tia and I are both going to be at New York City Comic Con this weekend. So if you're in New York for whatever reason and you happen to hear this episode before you go to the con, you should try to find us and say, "Hey, I'll give you some stickers." At least find me. I'll have stickers and pins for people. But anyways, Paul, what are you excited for this upcoming week?
Let me just quickly say I did read the first issue of Euthanauts. And I didn't buy issue 2, but because I felt it would read better as a trade. So I did enjoy issue 1. I was very excited to read a new Teenie Howard book. So I hope you enjoy it, Tia, when you pick up that first issue.
Well, the first 3 issues. So it's like
the first 3 issues. Yeah. You'll get that experience of reading it kind of in a chunk there. So
that's kind of what I was going for.
Yeah. I am excited for the second issue of Border Town. This is the Vertigo series, written by Eric Esquivel, and with art by Ramon Villalobos. I think Tara Bonvillain does the colors. That's an all-star team right there. That's why I picked up the first issue, and I absolutely loved it. I'm sure if you're on Twitter or if you're following along in comics, you've heard about this book. I really enjoyed the first issue a lot. Basically, the premise is that it's set in a border town in Arizona, I believe. And it's a town dealing with the issue of undocumented immigration. And there's a high school student who moves to the town, and he sort of falls in with a group of students that are undocumented immigrants. And he sort of recognizes himself in them because he's coming from a privileged place where he's part Irish, part Mexican. And he's kind of realized like, I need to be more in tune with my Mexican heritage, and I can identify with these people. At the same time, the town is being overrun by mythical creatures. And it turns out the border town is not just a border between the United States and Mexico. It's a border between a mystical, magical realm and the real world. And these creatures are coming through. So it's an interesting sort of a parallel story that they're telling there around this issue of immigration. And Ramon Villalobos' art is absolutely fantastic. I love his style. It's such It reminds me of Frank Quitely, obviously, the way he draws, but such an attention to detail in his work that really brings the character and the town to life in a really great way. So I'm very excited for this series to keep going. Can't wait for issue 2.
Cool. Yeah, I need to grab this. I've been putting it off. There's just so many comic books to read. I really want to try this, but I have so many other books. But this looks amazing. I'm glad to hear that you liked the first issue.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. If you were curious about it, or if you didn't hear about it, I think it's well worth your $3 or $4 to give it a shot.
Cool. Well, for me this week, I am excited, for Shatterstar #1. This is Tim Seeley, Gerardo Sandoval, and a couple other people. There were so many credits on this book, I didn't really know who was who or who was on what, because no website seems to have the same list of creators. So I at least put Tim Seeley and Gerardo Sandoval down. But anyways, this book is about Shatterstar. He's an X-Men character, so of course I'm reading it this week. Shatterstar is kind of cool. He's from an alternate universe called the Mojoverse, where he was like a prime, amazing super fighter in the pits, I guess. I'm sure the handful of X-Men people that I know listen to this show are going to call me out for this, but nonetheless, Shatterstar, he's pretty cool, pretty violent. And I've read only a little bit of comic books with him where he came back to the 616 universe and he started a relationship with Richter, who is a character in the X-Force team. And their relationship is fantastic and it's a lot of fun. Currently, I believe Shatterstar and Richter are on the West Coast Avengers with Hawkeye right now, aka Kate Bishop. But anyways, I just wanted to try this. I figure why not? But we are running into this weird period right now with X-Men books where there's too many of them. And that's a problem, because when there's too many X-Men books, listen, hear me out, okay? I've been reading X-Men nonstop for 10 years, and when there's too many X-Men books, that usually means bad things. It usually means, like, you know when there's a difference between a 24-episode TV show and a 10-episode TV show? This is like the 24-episode TV show where it's a lot of filler, and you do get choice moments and choice stories that are really good and drive the narrative, and they probably will stick around and people will remember. But then there's a lot of filler stuff, which means that we're going to end up with a lot of books that are just okay, and a lot of books that try things that are really off the wall and don't stick. And so we're going to get a lot of fluff along with the actual good stories. I think like 3 years ago, when it was just like 4 X-Men books, we had a lot of really good, solid storytelling in a lot of the X-Men books. And now we're branching out with like 15,000 writers. I know that a lot of people online, at least the X-Men folks that I started to talk to more and more, are really excited for every single book that's coming out. But like, it's like eating too much cake. It's totally a thing that you can do. You need to read other things, which is why I've been reading more manga and stuff. But I don't know. I really want this Shatterstar book to be good. I really want all the X-Men Black books that are coming out to be good. But I just know that they're not all going to be winners. And that means that we're going to see a bunch of X-Men cancellations, and we're going to see good books that aren't selling necessarily well, that have good stories get canceled, like Generation X. So I'm very worried. But, you know, I'm going to try all of these books because I hate myself and my wallet hates me. So, you know, I got to stick to my guns and be who I am, I guess. I don't know. I'm willing to try all this stuff, but I'm also very skeptical. That's kind of what it comes down to.
You heard it here first, folks. There are too many X-Men books, straight from Mike's lips to your ears.
Yeah. For our show this week, we are talking about one of the hardest things to talk about ever in comic books, politics. But I assure you, we are not here to scream and yell too much. We're here to talk about the idea of politics being in comic books kind of no matter what you do. And Tia brought this topic to us. I thought it was a great thing to talk about, and so we've been kind of talking in the pre-show about what we want to go with this. So I'm going to toss to Tia here, and then we're going to just run with it and see where we go.
Yeah, I just was thinking about how a lot of people in the last couple of years have seemed to feel very blindsided by the idea that there is suddenly politics in their comic books. And, you know, whether or not you agree with those people, which I think it's very clear where most of us stand on that, it occurred to me that for a lot of people, this might be a genuine surprise because they might not have ever really had to think about what it means to engage with politics in a way that made it very visible in parts of their lives that they wouldn't expect it. So like, if I'm going to watch a debate on TV or go vote, or like if I get pulled over and have to go to court or something for like my speeding ticket, like these are all very clear examples of where I might have to like be thinking about politics or the way that laws and kind of the governing methods of society would be brought to bear on me personally. Those are like specific examples of me engaging with that. But for a lot of people, those things engage with them, whether they like it or not. And they don't have a choice in the matter.
Right.
Whereas other people kind of can opt out of it. And by virtue of that privilege, and I know privilege is a really loaded word, but like, let's be honest here, the ability to sort of say, I don't really feel like dealing with this thing that is at best an inconvenience and at worst like could literally murder me, like it's a privilege to be able to do that. So like let's talk a little bit about how to see the different ways that politics are in every story that anybody ever tells ever, and then people can kind of decide for themselves if they agree or don't agree with the specifics of the political story that they are reading.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because like no matter what you're reading, there is some sort of belief system that's driving that story. Whether that's prose or if you're watching TV, watching a movie or something, like there are like some just implied politics in a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
And I have a list and stuff, but I thought that, like the first thing that I thought of was to go off your point. Comics are full of politics, whether you like it or not. Whether that's Batman fighting somebody because they're doing the wrong thing. He's going above the law to do that, which is like one of the big central arguments in the Batman story when they want to pivot Batman to be a good guy or a bad guy. That's still like a thing. Like, why do we think that that's bad that he's doing it, or why do we think that it's good that he's doing that? Why does Batman need to work outside of the law in some cases? He just knows things are right. Does he get to be that judge? Does he get to be that person? And in a lot of cases we say yes, because we believe that what Batman is doing is right, and that is like a political belief in some way. And that comes down to like a tie with morals as well, but that's a much bigger discussion. So Paul, I'll let you jump in here too as well.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I like this idea or this topic, because I think that is an assumption people make, that you can separate the art you enjoy or art people make from political viewpoints, and you really can't. And it's not until you have to like think about that you see that they're everywhere. I mean, the very first superhero story, the first Superman story in Action Comics #1 is about Superman, beating up corrupt politicians and stopping someone from being executed for a crime they didn't commit. He's a fighting for this little guy at the end of the Depression. He's a figure that embodies a political viewpoint, and that's never really changed. I just think people get used to thinking about superheroes in that sense of doing the right thing, but that impetus for doing it is inherently and essentially a political statement, right? That's what Superman is. He's he's an immigrant and he's fighting to do the right thing. That is a political idea.
And I think that more recent discussions of this have really, like, what people are really saying is that they see people who don't look like them at the center of these stories, and that it's somehow a forced political correctness.
Right.
And that actually got me thinking about the word politic and like what it actually means as a word. And it comes from a Greek word that means city, and also the Greek word for citizen comes from the word polis and politic. And so what we're really talking about here is who is a citizen of this community, who is a person in this community. Because if you're talking about the Greek concept of a city or of a civic structure, you're talking about something that is by and for the people, right? And the people who get a say in those structures and who have autonomy to move through them, those are people. And then there are other classes of individuals within those structures who don't get a say and who don't get to move through those structures with autonomy. To be really specific about it, in the Greek sense, there was slavery in Greece and all of that. So even though it was a democracy or whatever, but so this all got me thinking, the more recent conversations about forced diversity in comics, blah, 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 blah. If you get to the root of the word politics and political correctness, what we are talking about is who is a person in this community and who is allowed to have a story and be human and have autonomy in the way those stories are told and the way they engage with the community. And it's like, yeah, there it is. That's the argument,
Yeah. And that becomes extremely strange because I think outside of comic books, I mean, I'm making a huge assumption here, but outside of comic books, you walk down the street and you see a person, you can make a safe assumption that they are probably, especially in America, right? And this is very much an American thing, right? But if you're walking down the street in some city, there's a very good chance that person is a citizen and lives in this country and participates in the rest of the governing structure or in the economy or something like that makes them a valid person that should exist within the community. And yet we feel like this weird fear to tell stories about them or some folks feel this fear to tell stories about people because they don't understand them or they aren't a representative of them. But that is a complete flip. For people that have been reading books like that for years.
I would push back on that concept a little bit, if that's okay, Mike, because
yeah, totally.
If you walk down the street and you see a Black woman, there are multiple ways that she does not have the same autonomy or power in the structure of the community because
sure.
And they're trying to push a sexual predator through to the Supreme Court so they can overturn Roe v. Wade. There are a million ways that racism and sexism will limit the way that this woman can move through the world. And so I think that when we bring it back to comics, what is dangerous to people who are protesting these things is that it is a world where a person can go to their computer or pick up a pen and they can create something and they can make a world that addresses those real life problems. And it forces people to be confronted by it or to understand it, which is really either uncomfortable or something that they actively don't want because they benefit from the power as it stands.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and in comics, there's, for years, like to Paul's point, the idea of the Superman being this person who shows up trying to do the right thing for the people of this city, representing the little guy. These are stories that are in some ways just trying to enlighten others by telling a story that they may not have seen or heard in another way using a medium that they are comfortable with. And so, yes, in some ways there are comics out there that are being very blatant about their politics. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But there are also, big superhero stories that have been doing that for years and years and years. And we've just kind of gone along with it. And maybe you didn't agree with it, or maybe you did. But nonetheless, if you look at something like the X-Men in general, whether or not you think that they're this perfect representation of, the racial problems in the United States when they were created, or if you think that they are simply a story talking about a minority group being oppressed by the majority of group and how they try to survive and say, despite all of the hardships that we face, we must still be good people because that is for the betterment of our community and for the greater community. To me, that is a story that's being told over and over and over and over again in the X-Men books. And I don't care what X-Men you ever read, that is the core of their belief structure to a T. We are representing a minority group that needs to survive, and we want to help ourselves, and we also want to help the greater community. I dare you to argue with me about that, because whatever you think if you think that's not true, you are wrong. We'll just put that on the table right here.
Well, I think what's interesting is that we're talking about legacy characters like Superman, Batman, the X-Men, and I think, again, it's impossible to really separate art you consume from the politics or beliefs of the creator or the politics at the time it was created. I don't think Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were trying to make a point about racial, justice with the X-Men when they created it, but that was readers picked up on that thread. And after Chris Claremont and all the other writers have filtered their beliefs through those characters, people that read X-Men comics now are hopefully taking some of the positive messages of those characters and putting them into their daily life. And if they go on to create more comics, they're imbuing the characters with that. So you have these characters that are enriched by differing viewpoints and having political viewpoints put into their stories. And I think that the culminating effect is that you have a franchise like the X-Men, which is an important franchise that means a lot to a lot of people because of those values that the characters espouse.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to sit here and keep talking about X-Men unless one of you changes the subject, because I've got 5 or 6 different examples in my head that I could just go off of.
Well, I mean, yeah. I think that sometimes part of what the challenge is for people who have no choice but to constantly be politically vigilant in order to protect their own selfhood. They are very... they have a finely tuned sort of radar. They're capable of picking up the subtle ways that those narratives are everywhere in comics and in media. But for people who are a little bit more privileged and who have the choice of whether or not they want to engage in those politics, I could see how it would go over their heads until it smacks them in the face.
Yeah.
And then it smacks them in the face and they are not equipped to really process that story, and it feels confrontational to them, and that makes them defensive. Maybe I'm being really generous here, because
sure, yeah.
but
I think go ahead.
I mean, I don't think that everyone who objects to politics in comics is bad, but I do think that if they can't get past that initial reaction, then that, I'm willing to have this conversation with people and give them the benefit of the doubt that it really maybe is jarring for them to suddenly realize this, but they need to build a bridge and get over it,
Yeah. Because again, you can't separate the two. And I think it's interesting, if you want to approach comics or any type of pop culture or art you consume as an escape from politics, I understand that. Believe me, this past week, I've needed to get away from social media and get away from the news and escape out of my head for a little while. Comics are a great way to do that. But, I've also read comics that have political views that I vehemently disagree with. I still enjoyed them as stories and as comics, but the idea that somehow this is a new development, or the idea that somehow this is an agenda that's being forced on a reader, that's so laughable. You don't have to read the comic. Yeah. You don't have to read them, right?
Yeah.
And look, I also would love to read comics for escapism. I can't do that if I open the book and the first thing I see is some, gigantic breasted woman with a front wedgie getting raped.
Right.
Sorry, but that's political for me, because that's one of those things I have to be vigilant about. You know what I mean? So it's one person's escapism is another person's political.
Yeah, exactly. It's in the eye of the reader, really. And I like reading stories where I'm surprised by that stuff, where I'm surprised by a viewpoint or them using character that way. I wasn't expecting to read a Batman comic that was about the dangers of theocracy, right, this week, but I did. Yeah. So, and I really enjoyed it. It was an interesting take on the character in that regard. A book like Border Town is a book that's loaded with very important political ideas, and I think should spark a debate about those ideas. It's also just a really well-told, well-drawn story. I think I really value books that are able to kind of do both, and I certainly understand that different readers are going to have different reactions to that stuff. So the idea, but again, I find it so laughable that people believe that this is a new development and that politics have not been a part of comics. They're, whether you like it or not, they're part of everything you engage with, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just such a disingenuous way to complain about women and queer people and brown people suddenly being the heroes in their own stories.
Right.
And you know what I actually think this comes from? I'm going to like, sorry, comrades, we're going for it. Like, strap in, okay? But like, I honestly think that there's a capitalist critique we could make here, right? Because the fear is that if you get yours, then you're taking away mine. Right. And capitalism like really thrives on that concept. So, the thing is, I get the tenuous, wrong-headed, but seemingly logical connection that some of these internet babies are making between if you get yours, it takes away mine, and also comic shops, blah, blah, blah. But like, have you heard of... That's not true. And also, and also web comics and digital and like blah. There's a million. It's never a good idea to tackle these debates head on, because the premise from which these people are insisting you begin are not real to begin with. But there are also a lot of reasons why they're wrong that even work within their ridiculous internal logic. So like, it's not a zero-sum game. We can all have our comics.
Yeah,
exactly.
That is absolutely true. Like, the massive success of things like anything that Spike Trotman puts out is proof that these comics sell. Like, these people want these types of comics. So that doesn't make sense to me at all. But I think the one point I did wanted to kind of go back to was the idea of, people suddenly realizing, oh, there's politics in my comics. I think that the problem is the politics are, in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases they're a little bit more obvious, right? Like in the 80s or in maybe early 90s, you had to maybe guess if a character was queer. But now it's very like that person just says it and is that and embraces it, because that is the new norm. That is just how people are now. They no longer have to hide. In some cases, and I'm not trying to make a blanket statement about all of Western society, because that's 100% wrong. But I'm saying that those characters can be out and they can be who they are openly, because in comics we're a little bit more progressive typically, right? So those types of stories aren't necessarily negatively reflected on unless there's like a handful of people that are actually mad about them. And this is where we see comics that even just have some subtle like queer characters like Lumberjanes being on the banned books list, because I should say Lumberjanes doesn't have any subtlety there, but books like that being on the banned books list for children, and that doesn't make any sense, because kids are going to grow up into their teens and they're going to meet folks that are like that, that are part of the LGBT group. And it's
so
makes no
gross
sense
because you can like totally shove heterosexual love stories down the throats of children and everybody's fine with that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we're going to celebrate Romeo and Juliet for some reason, but we're not going to talk about the happy fun times at camp where two girls held hands. Like, come on.
Or even like a Disney princess story, like I would give a kid Lumberjanes way before I'd give a kid Beauty and the Friggin' Beast.
Right. And so it's interesting because it's the point that I was trying to get to was that, maybe the problem isn't so much that, oh my gosh, there's politics in my comics. It's that people are now able and have the intelligence to at least see those types of politics in comics. Because a lot of the folks that are screaming and yelling about this are a bit on the older side of things. I don't see any 17-year-old kids going out there screaming and yelling, well, they're taking away my comic books. It's interesting because now that you've been taught and shown how to read into comics a little bit further than just the surface level, you start to see the metaphor, you start to see the bigger picture of what's being told in the story, and that's what is upsetting people. Is they're like, wait, this is actually getting at X, Y, and Z, but it's like, but we've been doing this for years. We've been writing metaphors inside of these comic book stories, and people weren't picking up on them unless you were in the right community of learned folks who was like, no, but what they actually mean is this. And it kind of opens your eyes. But we've all been, a lot of people, I keep making these big we all things. I'm not trying to imply anything, but a lot of people who have been taught, to look further beyond what's written on the page and understand the bigger metaphor of the story are now grown up and they're able to do that. And maybe they are learned and they understand how these things work. But it's to act like this is a brand new concept in comics is like Paul said, it's laughable. This has been there since the beginning. And I mean, I think we're going to keep repeating that because it's so obvious. Yes, comics are full of these things. If you step outside of what's on the paper, there's a lot more being said in these books. And I think anyone who's been reading comic books for just like a few years or even a little bit of time can start to see that very, very easily.
Yeah, I think if you can really, you can't claim to really love this art form, this medium, comics, without celebrating that diversity of voices and celebrating the idea that it is something valuable. It can make a political statement. Yeah. I read a lot of dumb superhero comics, but there's something about them that I find appealing, and I realize the older I get that my values are really based on believing in doing the right thing, believing in Superman, believing in Batman. I identify with those characters and there's those missions, and that's where I think I formed a lot of my understanding of what right and wrong is. My ethics are based on reading these books as a kid, and whether that's good or not, I don't know, but I feel that's the value that they've given to my life, and I don't understand how someone who claims to love comics couldn't see that and want that for everyone else that reads them.
Yeah.
Well, I also think that we don't have an expectation of certain segments of the population that they cultivate any sense of empathy for others. So they don't really understand the value in reading stories that would force them to look at things from other perspectives. And kind of maybe it's a chicken or the egg sort of thing, where people whose identities are not frequently represented in mainstream media, they learn how to look at things from other perspectives because that's what they're kind of inundated with. And then they also learn how to really pick up on subtext because it's all they get. And so it's kind of created the perfect storm where the people who are sort of overrepresented can't really get out of their own head, and they don't have the skills to understand even why that would be important.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So I don't know how we fix all of this, but there it is.
Well, that's the thing. I think the key takeaway from a lot of this is the idea of empathy. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. Like a superhero, or if we're just talking about superhero comics, because I think that's where the biggest gripe comes in for a lot of folks, is superheroes are about helping others no matter who you are. If you're a person in need of help, a superhero is there to help you. That's kind of like the biggest thing you could take away and the biggest overgeneralization you can make about superhero comics. Mm-hmm. I don't know if the Punisher is necessarily a great example, but I think Superman is a good example.
He's an anti-hero.
True. Yeah. True. This is true. But when it comes to superheroes, they're here to help, and they're here to do whatever they can to get you out of whatever bind you're in order to make your life better, because that's what they're here for. And by no means does that segregate in any fashion. They just go, if you need help, I'm here to help you. And to the extent where you see something, you see this in comic books, and I see this in the Spider-Man game that I'm playing right now on PlayStation. The superheroes will still help the quote-unquote bad guy in some ways, because by no means does the superhero want a bad guy to die. The superhero wants to see them brought to justice, totally, but they don't want to see them die. They want them to be able to help them, and the story should continue, rehabilitate themselves to come back out into society to be a good citizen along with everybody else. But we don't usually follow up on that too much. But when we do, you do see some interesting stories of someone who's been in jail for 20 years and then they get out and then they're like, I want to do better in my life because I realize the errors of my ways. But that is kind of a Western society problem in general, in that we don't really focus too much on the rehabilitation, or we should focus more on it. And maybe that's reflected accurately in our stories. But
I don't know. That's an interesting point. I mean, the idea that comic books aren't divorced from reality; they're reflections of, the time that they're made. So that's why you have Superman being a hero for the Depression, and it's kind of, he's changed slightly over time, but he still stands for the same thing. I think it's important to, again, think about these things not separate from that. You can't. I always hate it when people talk about what would it be like if superheroes were real? Like, what would Superman really do if he was a real person? And I always want to say, Superman is real. Look at we have 80 years worth of stories that we've told. That's more real than most things, right? The idea is real. The idea of fighting crime, the idea of being a do-gooder, the idea of helping others, that's a very real thing. And I think that's why I'm going to keep reading a lot of really bad Superman and Batman comics, but because they reinforce in me that idea, like, yeah, doing the right thing is important. They reinforce my beliefs in a way. And I think that the idea that that's new or something that you can separate from everyday politics, it's just not true. They're a part of our world and a part of our everyday experience. Yeah.
And I think that kind of, I realized we kind of went off on a weird tangent here to talk about, good guys versus bad guys, because that's not necessarily the focus of this topic. Because I think what we're talking about here is like the strange political climate, and when I say strange political climate that we find ourselves in, and how comics should be reflecting that change in society. And yet we find there are groups of people that are saying, no, I don't want that. I want things to be like the quote unquote good old days, which has a lot of implications there. There is no good old days. Like the good old days for you, it was a bad old days for a whole hell of a lot of people. So I think what we're looking at here is we're ushering in a new like era of comic books, and we've got some folks that are just fighting that because I don't know. They try to use numbers to justify their costs, but on the whole, comic books are on the up and up. Like we saw a slope last year in your Diamond previews, but I guarantee you that if you factored in non-digital or non-Comixology digital, and you factored in anything that was funded by Kickstarter, Patreon, or Indiegogo, you would see a massive boom in terms of what comic books are selling. So to say that comic books are going downhill because of these changes is an absolute lie, flat out. I'm sorry, you're wrong.
I think that it's all ages comics that are selling at bookstores.
Yep.
It's
comics that are being published by like Scholastic and all that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. Spoiler alert, people don't like to buy comics at comic shops because of those dudes who hang out in the comic shops and act like that.
Yeah. The sort of the idea of gatekeeping, a gate keeps people out of comics, right? So I think the success of comics that you're talking about, Mike, the success of things like Kickstarter, the success of smaller press, that success is directly related to voices that were excluded in the past now being part of the discussion. More people can read comics because they see themselves in the comics. That's why comics are being successful right now, not because they need to be protected, right? I think there's a direct correlation there.
Yeah, and I mean, and on top of that, with the purchase of the digital comics, or using Kickstarter to back physical comics, even, or Indiegogo to back physical comics, like people are allowed to then consume and enjoy their comic books in their own way with no influence from others unless they want it. Like the opt-in for that influence of others is totally optional. There's no, I have to go to the shop and put myself through this entire experience that can be very not fun for a lot of people. Even going to a good comic book shop can be a not fun experience for people just because it can be very overwhelming. And so I think, people being able to buy their comics however they want, from whoever they want, from wherever they are, is massive. And plus we're not even talking about like where international comics and international folks come in, with the ability to buy Western comics for the first time at the same time as their like Western cohorts who are also reading this comic. You can all get the book at the same time. That's a whole thing to build a very special niche community. And these books thrive. Like you look at a book like Check Please, like I love that web series so much. Like the print copies for that cannot stay on the shelves. The creator of that, whose name totally escapes me, I know that I met her at cons before, and she's like, I just don't have any of these books left. I'm sorry. Like, it's Friday. I'm sorry. I'm already out. Because that book just cannot stay on the shelves. It's amazing. Because things like that are only on the web, and people are able to experience it themselves and have like this personal relationship with a comic without having to deal with all of the weirdness that comes with other books. And I think that's like where indie comic books excel in the first place, but that's a different conversation.
Yeah. But you brought up the idea of there being, you were hinting at the idea of there being a shared experience of reading comics. And I think that's maybe tying it kind of together here, is the idea that if we think of politics not as something that happens only in Washington or happens only in certain aspects of our life, instead think of politics as a community, right? Being a citizen in a community, being a comics consumer and loving comics means you're a part of this sort of, I'll say, elite community, right? Because comics are great. But I think that that requires you to recognize what that means, being a part of a community and being an open community that treats other people fairly and is accessible to everyone. That's what's important, and that's how comics are going to survive as an art form.
Yeah. And I think that I would add to that really lovely sort of way to tie it all together by saying that if you find yourself in a position where you're suddenly realizing that there's politics in your comics, then you are probably the perfect person to extend your hand, to lift other people up, to pass the mic, to share your soapbox, and to help kind of use your position to get other people's voices into the conversation and get their stories sort of in the mix and give them some visibility, because it's not a zero-sum game. It does not take away from your own.
Right. Comics are for everyone. We'll just put that blanket on there because,
Good.
Perfect.
We fixed it. The end.
We fixed it.
Cool. Yet again.
Well, cool. I guess I'm sure we could talk more and more, but I guess we are running out of tape. So let's wrap things up here. You can follow everyone on Twitter. You can follow Tia at Portrait of Madam X. You can follow Paul on Twitter at Oh Hi Paul, and you can follow me at Mike Rappin. You can follow the show at IRCB Podcast, where we retweet all sorts of fun stuff. It's International Comic Book Day today, apparently, but this is Sunday, so sorry you're going to hear this on Wednesday. I posted a poll today, which is, what's the next unlikely superhero team-up, Batman and ... and I put 4 fun little mix-ups there.
You can check out our Goodreads group. We have weekly threads. This week's thread was comics that surprised you the most. And you can find us on the internet at irscbpodcast.com, and we have the pronunciation guide there, as well as merch and all the shows.
As always, if you have comments, questions, suggestions of vegan chili recipes, email the show at ircb@destroytheside.org. There's also a couple ways you can support the show. The most obvious and easiest one is to rate, review, and subscribe on whatever podcast platform you listen to us. And check out the Patreon, patreon.com/ircbpodcast. If you join and support the show, you get exclusive audio, early access to every episodes, and a bunch of other free goodies, so check that out.
Infinity Shred does all the music for the show. They are the best band in the universe. Xander, he's a very cool cat. He also edits the show. I want to say thank you to Paul and Tia for being on the episode this week. Thank you, listeners, for listening to this episode. And until next time, eat your vegetables, or Grant Morrison will steal your eyeballs.
Damn.
Thank you.